So, first up today, we have Dom Katz on the importance of feedback. Over the past decade, Dom has been an Agile coach, delivery lead, and product owner for organizations from startups to governments and everything in between. More recently, he joined the global hotel guest acquisition platform, SiteMinder, as product operations lead to help all product and design folk get from idea to live more effectively. Here's a fun fact. Dom is a German who lives in Sydney, Australia, with his wife and 3 kids, neither of whom shy away from giving him daily feedback. Ladies and gentlemen, Dom Katz.
Thanks, John. Morning, everybody. How good was the keynote this morning? Feedback is the new black, because feedback is always fashionable, right? There's so much information out there, and always new information coming out on giving feedback. It's insane, but I believe that's because it's important, right? But I also believe that only focusing on giving feedback misses the bigger picture. There's so much more in the world of feedback that we can learn and grow from. So today, I want to talk about the role autonomy plays in unleashing our team's potential, the role trust plays in achieving that, and then talk about some practical tools that we can use in the world of feedback. Now, given the topic, it only seems fitting that I'll be asking you for feedback on this talk afterwards, which could potentially be awkward because we don't know each other yet, so you don't know whether I'm just looking for straight up praise, which I don't mind, of course, or an evaluation against any of the other talks, which I'm not, or whether I would look genuinely for feedback on how to make this talk more engaging, which of course I am. And if you feel so inclined, you could follow this structure and tell me what I said at the time, why you feel this particular point could be more engaging, and then I'm really curious to hear your suggestion of how to make it more engaging. So after this talk, please come see me outside in the lobby or over lunch, and I'm really curious to hear what you come up with. Now, as John mentioned, I was lucky enough to fulfill a couple of roles in my life before, but the thing that always stuck with me was the coaching aspect, which for me means helping individuals and teams to become the best version of themselves. And that naturally resolves a lot around giving feedback to others, which makes me a pretty unlikely coach because always throughout my life, growing up and during uni and in the early years of my career, I convinced myself that it's just not my place to give feedback to anyone, right? It's just my opinion. And I would be convinced that the person sitting opposite of me would much rather find out in the bathroom later that they have spinach in their teeth than me telling them right then and there and potentially putting them into an embarrassing situation, right? That is, until I met my wife. And what I loved about my wife, and still do, is just how opinionated she is on everything and just how clear her opinions are. There's never any guesswork, right? I never had to wonder why she's not wearing that necklace that I got her for Christmas, because at the time she would tell me, thanks, Dom, I can see how you tried, but I don't really like it. Do you still have the receipt? So there's no guesswork. I know exactly where I stand with her, right? Because that's what feedback really does. It makes things explicit, and it helps us learn about ourselves and about the preferences of others. But what I also noticed is that feedback creates tension, right? Every piece of feedback stings a little, and it makes us uncomfortable, and it makes us vulnerable. And there we are. It makes us uncomfortable and makes us vulnerable and forces us to think, right? What do we do with that piece of information, and how do we take that relationship further now that we know the real thing of what people really think about us? So feedback accelerates relationship. That little tension accelerates the relationship because we're forced to make decision of what we do with that piece of feedback. And in the same way, feedback accelerates team building because we're forced to make decisions. Cheery teams are amazing. Cheery teams that never have any tension within them, they're amazing, but they're often not really resilient, right? And building up that tension little by little with every piece of feedback helps us build that muscle to become more resilient as a team. And that's important because we don't live in the yesterday anymore. Yesterday was all around efficiency with really hierarchical structures and people spending lots of time with people in the same role and had lots of time to get to know each other. That's not the world we live in anymore. There was a massive study done by one of the big consultancies around the future of work, and they looked into this. They talked to thousands of executives, and their big finding was, are you ready for this? Tomorrow will be about innovation. Now that sounds odd because I always thought today is already about innovation, but we're already talking a lot about innovation, and Dom Price made a point about it yesterday in his talk when he said, we're living the future today already, right? And the keynote before, when we were talking about open companies and how it drives team performance, that's important today when we live in a world where networks of teams are really pushing agility and company performance forward. But currently, we're also in a stage where we already are in a stage where we have those teams. We have cross-functional product teams. That's all well and good, but often the piece that's missing is really autonomous teams, right? And allowing the teams to be agile and to form and disband to solve problems where they appear. And the fellows who got together about 18 years ago to write the Agile Manifesto, I believe that they left us a hint. They said, build projects around motivated individuals, give them the environment and support they need, and trust them to get the job done. Because that's essentially what it is, right? Whether a company wants to scale or whether it wants to scale a, say, transformation effort or change effort within the organization needs to be at least willing to give autonomy to the team and let them do what they do best. And in turn, the team delivers results to earn more of their trust. The more they deliver, the more autonomy they get. So it's a nice reinforcing cycle in theory. And that's what happens, right? When there is trust, we go, yep, okay, fantastic, go and do it, go off to the right. When there's no trust in the organization, you quickly notice, because you get into this whirlwind of meetings and sign-offs and pre-meetings before pre-meetings and post-meetings just to check in, right? When trust goes down, governance typically goes up. And I was lucky enough to work at a really fast-growing organization, and just to paint you the picture, they held multiple product lines, people popping up every week. There was never enough desk space anywhere. It was absolute chaos. Lots of fun, but chaos all around the place. Probably much like these two up there. And I was working with one of their senior leaders, and she took me aside one day and she said, Dom, I really need to give my teams more autonomy. I just don't trust that they are having the right conversations. Which sounded odd, right? I thought it's only about delivering results, but she said, I just don't trust them to have the right conversations. And what she meant by that is, I just don't trust them to talk about the real issues in their teams and escalate any blockers so that I can actually help them move past that and improve. So it's not only about delivering results that earns trust, but delivering results in the right way. And we already know through multiple sessions over the last couple of days that psychological safety is a major contributor to team performance and delivering results the right way, right? And I really hope you had the chance to view one of the presentations over the last 2 days, because they would be able to explain this much more eloquent than I ever could. But just in case you haven't, here's a really brief primer on psychological safety. It's Amy Edmondson who came up with the concept a couple of years ago. She says, psychological safety is a belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. And in our teams, the best mechanism to foster that psychological safety is often a retrospective, right? Where we get together and we talk about, ideally openly, what went well and the things we can improve. Now, another organization I was lucky enough to work with was incredibly large, and working with one of their teams, I only had a couple of days to work with them. So my goal was to make their retrospective the most valuable ceremony they had in their sprint, to allow them to improve by themselves on an ongoing basis. And I took everyone out for coffee individually just to get context on the team. And what was really clear was that everyone knew what the issue was in the team, right? The PM was too pushy, and he was just pushing too much work into the sprint, which created a lot of stress and low quality of work. Even the PM knew that that was a problem, but he thought that's just his job, and he's waiting for the team to push back on him. So we did a little experiment. I let them run their retro, and after the retro, we talked about trust and about giving feedback and the importance of it all. And the experiment we did was, I gave everyone 10 minutes to write down one piece of praise for anyone in the room and one piece of constructive feedback. And the observation afterwards was really interesting, because sharing praise, everyone were high-fiving themselves, and there was lots of that going on, and laughter, and everything was great, but no one really wanted to share the piece of constructive feedback. It was really awkward in this session because there was just dead silence. Eventually somebody came forward and they said a couple of things, but really no one addressed the real issue. And that's because there was no psychological safety. It was really risky for them to step forward and be the first one in a group setting to address the real issue. So if it's not the retro that sits at the heart of this trust onion, if you will, then what is it? And I've asked myself that question over the couple of years until I came across the work of Rachel Botsman. And Rachel Botsman's work is amazing. She talks a lot about trust, and she talks about this thing called the trust leap, which occurs when we are doing something for the first time. We take a risk into something. This is her. She says, a trust leap occurs when we take a risk and do something new or different from the way we've always done it. And for people in the retrospective trying to share constructive feedback for the first time, that's clearly a risk and something that they haven't done before. And I believe that accounts for a lot of us. And what I love about her work is that she encourages us to think about it as an actual leap, where we stand sort of at the brink to assess whether we can make the jump safely given all the uncertainty. Now, in a team setting, there are a lot more variables to consider, a lot more potential sharks in the water, right? Which makes it a lot more risky. And I want to take this analogy just a little bit further, because a lot of us are often tempted to just outsource feedback to, say, a manager or one of our leaders, because we don't want to be uncomfortable and we don't want to be in that situation. But that's a very, very dangerous bridge to go on, to pretend that that's a safer way. I've never seen this work in my life, where people would see a problem, they would outsource it to a manager, and it would come back through the team, and the feedback would be given on that way. We need to use our managers for escalation routes. That's really important, right? That those escalation routes, if nothing else works, are open, but we can't solely rely on them. So instead, my suggestion is let's try to contain the risk and start really small with the individuals in the team rather than with the team itself. So again, if it's not the retrospective that sits in the heart of this, it's you, right? You sit in the heart of this. Every one of us sits in the heart of this to create trust within the team, with the individuals in the team, before we go out to the broader team. I can't trust any team that doesn't trust its team members individually. Right? So it's really about creating trust to feel safe amongst the individuals before we can feel safe in a team setting. Just a quick recap, we talked about the importance of autonomy to unleash our team's potential, and we talk about the role that trust plays in that. But that trust doesn't just magically appear in a team, right? So now I want to talk a bit about feedback and how we can use feedback to help us there. Feedback is really anything we learn about ourselves, right? It can be an aching knee, it can be the eye roll of our 7-year-old daughter, and it can be the unwarranted comment of a coworker that we may or may not agree with. A question for you, who in the past month has received any feedback in a work setting? Yeah, that's a lot. Who has received feedback in the last week before you came here? And who of you really enjoyed that process of getting feedback? There's still a couple, I'm surprised. That's good, that's a good change. But this is how it typically look like, right? When we get asked this ominous question, do you have 5 minutes? To be fair, in our work setting, we typically get feedback from people who feel really confident and really comfortable giving feedback, which is most likely the equivalent to this blog right here. Right, Simon Cowell, very well known for expressing his ideas and opinions clearly to people who clearly didn't know before what he was about to tell them before they rocked up on stage. But of course, we already know how to give feedback, right? Companies are spending millions and millions of dollars on teaching us and sending us to trainings of how to give feedback. And if we're not one of the lucky ones to be on one of those trainings, there's tons and tons of information out there about feedback. This is typically what you find in those talks. Talk about feedback in a structured way where you first explain the situation where something happened, talk about the behavior that you observed, not the character of the person, but the behavior that you observed, in a way that they would have to agree with, then talk about the impact that that behavior had on you personally, because that's something that nobody can really argue with, right? And then when you offer a suggestion or a request of the change of behavior that you would like to see. And then wrap it all up in a nice package of positivity, if you will. And yes, I know that's often referred to as a shit sandwich. I know that. But Dan North did a fantastic talk right here on stage at Atlassian Summit a couple of years ago. And he talks about this beautifully and does away with some of the misconceptions around a feedback sandwich. So, practically applied, when Simon says, "You just destroyed my favorite song," we know that we could reframe it and say, "Hey, it's so brave of you to come up here on stage with us, but when you started singing, I noticed that you didn't hit any of your notes, so I can't let you pass, and you will have it incredibly hard to build a professional career around this. But please don't let it discourage you from singing for fun, because you clearly enjoy it." And less entertaining, granted, but the same idea and likely not ending in tears and denial. But again, to my point earlier, by focusing only on giving feedback, we are missing the bigger picture. And I'm saying that because I was lucky enough to be part of an amazing team, a team where there was no egos. Everything was just about problems to solve and solutions to those problems. Nobody cared who came up with the final idea, that made it into the solution. Everyone just cared about the best outcome. And it feels truly liberating to be part of such a team where it's okay to share a really early draft of something and have it ripped apart in front of your eyes and know that it's going to come out 100 times better. When I shared a really early version of this talk, I knew that I was in for a treat when they interrupted me after 5 minutes and said, "Do we have to listen to this till the end, or can we give you feedback right away?" It still doesn't feel nice and great, right? But it's okay, because when you trust your team, you know that it's just for the better. So I've thought about this a lot, and I tried to come up with 4 main principles to condense that I've learned about feedback, other than giving feedback, right? And the first one is about mindset. When we talk about mindset, it's really, really important to to make it safe and to keep it safe, because feedback is not a one-off thing, right? We have to work hard at it and maintain it really, really carefully. One thing that often stands in the way of making something safe is judgment, right? And here's why. This is Stephen Covey, and he says, we judge ourselves by our intentions, but judge others based on their actions. Think about that for a minute. We judge ourselves by our intentions, but judge others based on their actions. And I absolutely love that quote. I love it so much because it's so unfair. It's so unfair to us because it robs us of our own curiosity and of all the learning opportunities that come with understanding what is actually going on. And I came across the work of Dave Gray, who is a fantastic author, and he says understanding requires empathy. And he draws up a model much like this, where he says, there is reality, we're all part of reality, but what I experience of that reality is just a small part. And then what I pay attention to of my experience is what Sean Aker called a couple of days ago, the snowflakes in the blizzard, right? It's just a small slither, but that slither is the basis for everything we assign meaning to. We draw our assumptions, we draw conclusions from, and we form our beliefs, which then led to actions, which is the only thing that you see. Consider this gentleman over there. He looked at me a bit, swaying his head a little left to right and looking at me a bit funny. And I may assume that he doesn't understand the point I'm making or doesn't agree with the point I'm making, which makes me panic, right? So I'm led to explaining the same thing over and over and over again and telling the same story 4 times, which you hear and you get confused and you look at me with the same sort of reaction, swaying your head a little, looking at me funny. And I see that, and suddenly the whole room is just swaying their head from left to right and looking at me funny, and at that point I'm just losing my plot. I have no idea what's going on anymore, right? The point being, we only ever see the actions of others, but we never understand the internal thought process that led to that action. So instead of judging others, we should check whether we're in the right mindset to give feedback in the first place. Right? Are we angry or emotional? Or are we calm and collected and ready to give feedback? Giving feedback and timeliness of that is really important, but so is the mindset in which you're in before you give feedback. We can also try and assume positive intent, knowing the model that I just showed you, and knowing that there's much more going on in terms of internal thought processes. We can assume positive intent, at least, and buy us some patience to really understand and seek to understand what's going on internally. Moving on to asking for feedback, and it's really important that we give permission to others to give feedback. I believe the best feedback we get is when we actually make it open and give permission to really criticize us and to help us get better. And by that I don't mean, do you have any feedback on this? If you ask a shy question, you're likely to get a shy answer. Now, I mean being really clear with what you're looking for, much like I did at the beginning of this talk. And I believe the reason why we don't ask for feedback consistently is because we don't want to put ourselves into the center of things, right? We don't want to come across as egotistical and make it all about us. And a colleague recently shared with me that she said, look, Dom, I don't want to ask for feedback because people assume that I'm asking for praise anyway, And fair enough, that may well be the reason you're asking for feedback, but that's okay, right? You can put yourself out there and say that you put a lot of hard work in this and that, you would like a positive, some positive feedback on that. But we need to be really clear on what we're actually asking for. So instead of hesitating to ask, try and be really specific in what you are asking for. And try and make it a habit. Feedback is not a one-off thing that we can just, do and celebrate and go, yep, we've done this feedback thing, now we can move on with our daily life. No, try and bake it into your daily interactions. I'm currently working with a team who has made it part, who scheduled meetings, in a regular interval, just to save some time so that people can individually give each other feedback. And they really enjoy it because they get to go, drink a coffee and then really talk about how they can improve individually. Talking about embracing your resistance when we receive feedback. And I believe that is the most critical part to it all. If we get to a point that we are able to receive feedback well, that's where all the learning is. We can be the best at delivering feedback and giving feedback and just dishing it out everywhere. But if our partner doesn't receive any feedback and doesn't do anything with it, then what's the point? We might as well not, right? And the problem with all of that is, with receiving feedback, is that our brains are wired to protect us, right? They're wired to detect threats out there and then to protect us from them. That's not really helpful in our modern society. But feedback by our brain is perceived as a threat. When somebody threatens our capability and questions them, so our brain is naturally inclined to fight it. And Sheila Heen, who did a lot of research in that area, in her book, Thank You for the Feedback, she says that we're most likely to respond to feedback in one of three ways: with a truth trigger, questioning the relationship, or questioning the identity of it. And I'll explain that a bit further. Imagine your coworker tells you, "You're late again," right? You're most likely to react to that in one of three ways. You may say, "That's not true. You have no idea what you're talking about. You weren't even here yesterday, so I'm not taking this from you." Right? You may respond to that in a way to say, "Who are you to tell me that? You are the one always being late. You have no right to give me that feedback, so I'm not taking that from you." Or you may take it slightly differently and question your own identity, where you go, "Oh my God, I'm late again. Wow, I'm a terrible, terrible person. What does that say about me and my life? I can't take this anymore," and just go away and dismiss it in that way. And I came across this quote recently, and I could not find the author of it, but it captures so well of what we're doing to ourselves. It says, "What if a child stopped learning how to walk because it was afraid of falling?" And it's exactly what we're doing to ourselves. But if we want to achieve mastery in our job and get better and better and better at it, we cannot be afraid of the perceived threat of feedback. We have to embrace that. Right? So how do we embrace feedback? I believe that instead of dismissing feedback outright, take a breath and just try to create some buffer and not react straight away, because it's probably your resistance reacting, which you can't really do anything about anyway. So take a breath and create some buffer. And then look for data points and themes, right? You may not agree with a piece of feedback, but if you hear it over and over and over again, maybe there's just something there to dig deeper into. And then try to separate the who said something from the what is being said. Now, that's not always easy, and I get that. But if we achieve a state where we can separate those two and look at the what is being said, the feedback objectively, just for a moment, and see whether there is something there, try it on, I think there's a lot of opportunity for growth there. And if you don't agree with that piece of feedback, you have the absolute right to dismiss it. Absolutely. Just try to not dismiss it right away out of your own inner resistance. Try to have a look at it. I do want to quickly touch on giving feedback, and something that helps me place the reason for giving feedback in a broader context. Kim Scott talked about this, and she has this fantastic book around radical candor, and she has a TED Talk on it, which I suggest you have a look at. But she talks about feedback on two different axes. She says to give feedback effectively, one, we need to care, We need to care about the relationship with the other person. And we need to be willing to challenge them. That is really important. If we don't care and we only challenge that person, we may come across as aggressive. If we don't care and we don't challenge, we may come across as manipulative. And that's me in the top left corner there, caring too much about that person to tell them they have spinach in their teeth that I don't say anything. Right? There's something not right here. Right? So this framework helps me because if I'm talking about feedback with the person for the first time, I tend to tell them that I'm giving them feedback because I care about the relationship with us, right? Otherwise, I wouldn't bother putting me into an uncomfortable situation and giving them feedback, right? I'd just, let them do their thing. So instead of going the easy way, we can take responsibility to really tell them that and to take responsibility of another person's growth opportunity. We can care about the relationship and dare to challenge them. And then we can encourage direct communication, which I think is an interesting point because especially with the leaders I have here in the room today, most likely people come to you often with complaints or problems, and they ask you to help them solve it by talking to someone else or talking to someone else's manager about this piece of work. And I always have the feeling that honors me, that people come to me and share openly what their struggles are. That's great. And as leaders, we are wanting, that's our role. We want to help those people. But my advice is don't do that. Encourage direct communication first. Allow them to build the relationship amongst themselves and build that trust first. And only if that's not working, provide an escalation route for them, but don't start there. Right? Encourage direct communication between the people and between your team. So these are the 4 things that we talked about: making it safe and keeping it safe, giving permission to give feedback, embracing your inner resistance, and to dare and be candid with each other. Now, we talked about how autonomy plays a big role in unleashing your team's potential. And we talked about trust and the role it plays in there, and how trust doesn't appear magically in a team setting, that we should try and foster trust as individuals first. And then we talked a lot about how feedback is one of the mechanisms that can help us achieve that trust amongst individuals. But there's one more thing. So far, we've only talked about feeding each other information and how to consume that information better. But information only ever creates self-awareness. But in self-awareness doesn't drive action, it doesn't change any behavior. But feeling responsible for the outcome does change behavior. So how do we achieve a feeling of responsibility with our partner to actually change their behavior? I believe we need to create an environment where people can think for themselves before we give them the answers, right? We need to teach our team members how to fish, in a sense, how to think for themselves. So in that case, the best feedback is no feedback, which sounds odd given the last 35 minutes that I spent talking to you about the importance of feedback and how we receive it. Right? The best feedback is no feedback. And what I mean by that is that if we give each other feedback, we tell the person, we give them information about what they should change. But by giving no feedback and asking a couple of questions helps people uncover the truth for themselves. So consider the difference in this example. Say you get asked to provide feedback on a report, right? Hey, this is due tomorrow, can you give me feedback on it? And you could say, well, there's this outline here. Well, I like the outline. I would add a graph here, and I would, probably add an executive summary to it. Great. But you could also approach it in a way that you assume that people have the answers for themselves already, right? And instead go, what's the purpose of the report? In what way do you think you're achieving that purpose with what you've written? Who's the audience of it? If you were part of the audience, what would you like to see? And those questions seem obvious when you sit there and you hear them and you go, sure. But oftentimes people don't think about those things when they get asked to write a report on something. And so just by confirming that they know the answers to those questions, we can help them think for themselves. And only then we can offer our opinion, because we probably have an opinion on it, But don't just blurt them out and try to help them right away. Try to help them think about these things. And here are some of my favorite questions. And again, there's a book around it, and Michael Bungay Senior writes a lot more about these questions in a book called The Coaching Habit, where he explains how to use those questions also in a one-on-one setting, when you just have a one-on-one with your peer. So some of those questions that I try to bake into my day-to-day interactions with them is, what's on your mind? What are your biggest challenges? What's the goal you want to achieve? How could you solve those challenges? How could you get there? And only then ask, well, how can I help with this? How do you want to follow up on this? So I think the world of feedback is incredibly important, and I was really glad to see and hear Miga talk about the value of openness and how openness drives team performance this morning, right? And the research they've done around this. And I imagine a world where organizations are made out of trusted, autonomous teams that achieve extraordinary results and share a culture of trust, curiosity, and learning, where people are unafraid to be vulnerable and share their observations about others, knowing that it's for the better for everyone. So thank you, and I'm really, really, really looking forward to your feedback outside of